Hi, everybody. Welcome. Nice to see you. We are glad to have you back with us for our first discussion of 2021 and what a discussion for a movie that I will say, if you had asked me a few months ago, you think this will be one of your Monday night discussion movies, I would have said probably not. But thanks to the suggestion of two people whose knowledge of and interest in film I have great respect for, that is what we are doing. And also, I had a suspicion that it would lead to an all-time great performance by our guest moderator and her family. Jennifer, you did not disappoint. How are you doing tonight?
Fine, how are you?
Fine, thank you. We will get to the movie in a minute, but first, a little business. Please keep yourselves on mute during the course of our discussion. I will call on you to make your question and comment, and I will know to call on you because you can use the raise hand function in Zoom, and I will see a little blue hand and I will call on you. We will try to get to everybody at least once. If folks come back with a second comment or question, we may not be able to get to the people up for the second round, depending on time. But in general, we've been able to get to almost everybody. We would love also for you to say hi in the chat using the Zoom chat function. We'd love to know where you're from, if you're from outside the greater Philadelphia area. And as you can see, we've got folks from certainly all over the country and even all over the world joining us. So if you're one of those folks, you would add a new dot to the map, please consider visiting the Film Studies online section of brynmarfilm.org and go to the Where in the World form and let us know a bit more about how you found us and how we're doing. But otherwise, if you don't want to do that in the chat tonight, you can certainly introduce yourselves and also chat amongst yourselves about other things related to the film or related just to film in general. And with that, I think we are ready to get started. And I see that we have already one of our regulars set to go. David, how are you?
I'm great. First time for the year for all of us. And thank you again. And Jennifer, I grew up listening to Danny Kaye. It was one of the relatively few things that my parents had records galore. We had orchestra stuff and we had Danny Kaye. And I remember probably around the time the movie came out, listening to this, some of the soundtrack, and I loved the gibberish then, and I loved the gibberish listening to it again, reminding me of those early days. I know a lot about Danny Kaye, but I never actually learned anything about how he came to the combination of being such a wonderful, funny actor, dancer, and singer. And if you could talk a tiny bit about that, and just a quick comment, if nobody noticed, the baby was twins, who they often do that in movies. Twins and triplets have a great movie career when they're young. So thank you so much for the reminder, and hopefully I'm giving you something to kick off on.
Thanks, David. Jennifer, did you have any thoughts on Kaye's combination of talents?
I don't really know that much about Danny Kaye's early career, to be honest. Before he was in this film, he was in several other films, one with Panama and Frank, Knock on Wood, where he played a ventriloquist. What I think, though, and I don't know how true this is, but I'm going to say it anyway, I think the secret to Danny Kaye's success is his wife, Sylvia Fine, because she wrote a number of these songs, including The Maladjusted Jester, which is one of these perfect songs where he does all of the language really fast, you know, that when he performs in the court, and it does his visual slapstick stunts as well as his ability to articulate every word in a sentence so that it's funny and goes with the melody. So, and she did this for him a lot. She wrote a lot of his early songs as well. So I'm going to say the secret to Danny Kaye's fandom is Sylvia Fine.
So the woman behind the man in this case.
Yeah.
Yes. I think that, you know, Danny Kaye is sort of one of the best versions or the prime examples of a type of performer that was popular and could always make a good living in Hollywood at this time, which is sort of, he wasn't the best singer in the world. He wasn't the best physical comedian in the world. He wasn't the best leading man in the world, but he was more than serviceable in all of those areas. And you see performers like that. There were times in this movie he reminded me of Donald O'Connor in Singing in the Rain, who I don't think ever got to, well, I guess if you count Miracle of Morgan's Creek, maybe got to be a lead once, but wasn't typically ever a lead, but he combined these talents as well. And there were a host of folks who did. And I think the lineage comes from being a performer in some other realm before cinema, and having to have the chops to be successful in some version of live performance. And a lot of those folks, I mean, Panama and Frank made a number of the Hope and Crosby movies, if I'm not mistaken. And there you have a couple of other performers who had multiple skill sets as well. So I think there was much more of a role for this type of figure in Hollywood back when Hollywood made more musicals and combined, comedy and music and romance more often than they do now. Things are in a way more sort of siloed. And so you don't have a lot of performers who can check all these boxes. So you do have a few, I think, but it's surprising how difficult it would be to name them because the movies don't typically do this anymore. Certainly not with any consistency.
I'll also add, if you want to know more about Danny Kaye and Sylvia Fine, the Library of Congress has their papers, and a lot of it's digitized. So you could see things like the original scores for some of the songs and photos of their wedding and all kinds of stuff like that, just at loc.gov.
Let's see. Richard, do you have a question or comment?
Yes, I caught.
Sorry, Richard Chait. Go ahead, Richard.
Me?
Yes, Richard Chait, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. I had caught the movie yesterday with my wife, and we both thoroughly enjoyed it. I remember seeing the movie in the theater when I was a little kid, and I loved it. My wife's comment was it was like a cross between the Marx Brothers and the Three Stooges, but the best of the Three Stooges and the best of the Marx Brothers.
Okay. I think that is an interesting point of comparison. I don't know that I got more Marx Brothers than I got Three Stooges, but I think there were some important differences. I felt that this, and you alluded to this in your introduction, Jennifer, I felt that this movie was obviously a lot more self-aware in kind of a quasi experimental, if not serious way. I mean, there was some self-awareness in the Marx Brothers, but I felt like this was coming from a different place. And I also felt that this movie was aware that it had an opportunity to at least bend the envelope about gender, which I think it succeeded in some ways and failed in others. Jennifer, do you have any thoughts on those?
Yeah, I love the Marx Brothers comparison that you made, Richard. And I think that the Marx Brothers also have funny things to say about gender and relationships, but also the Marx Brothers were far more interested in music than their films might let on. There's always operatic references in their movies. And even Groucho starred in a television opera when he was 70, operetta of Mikado. So I think that the connection between their love of music that goes across those two kinds of films is a great comparison. I could imagine Danny Kaye in a Marx Brothers movie if he had been a bit younger. So that's great. I like it.
Lillian, you have a question or comment?
I just wanted to say thank you, Jennifer. I had the best time today afternoon. I was watching, I was by myself laughing out loud yesterday. I thought, And I saw that movie too, probably a million years ago. But I was really bowled over to remember how fantastic a performer Danny Kaye was. I mean, I love the intro you did with your kids, but you know, he used to do that stuff where he talked that gobbledygook, you know, and he was so perfect. I mean, these quick changes, you know, snap your fingers, you're one thing, snap your fingers, you're the other thing. You can talk about all the technical things you want about this movie. It was just great fun.
Yeah, and we have to credit Meredith Goldsmith, who I think is on the call, for suggesting it, because she's the one who really wanted this movie, and I'm so glad that she suggested it, because it is just a hoot. I watched it a couple of times since, you know, just to remember things for this discussion, and every time I notice little things in Danny Kaye's face, like when he's doing the Maladjusted Jester song, and every time there's somebody playing that Spanish guitar who smells with, you know, in time with the plucking. I can't do it because I'm laughing, but even little things like that, he's just outstanding. You're absolutely right.
Joss, do you have a question or comment?
Sure. First of all, Happy New Year to everybody. Much of what I had to say has been said by others, but I do want to echo a couple of things. First of all, the Marx Brothers references, I was particularly some of the miming that Danny Kaye did immediately reminded me of Harpo.
Yeah.
It was just right in my face. I also saw this as a kid at a Saturday matinee, probably with, you know, cartoons and some other silly movie, and I liked it as much now as I did then. And I wonder if anyone has any thoughts about this, reflecting forward to another silly movie about that mythical period of time. And I'm referring in particular to the Princess Bride. Just any thoughts about a comparison there?
I thought about that watching the movie this time. I think certainly the comparison between some of the characters and some of the roles they play, some of the sort of use of poisoning and things like that. But also, you know, I mean, it's hard to sort of say, was Princess Bride influenced by a movie like this, or were they both influenced by a larger series of conventions and tropes for movies like this? But I definitely saw some points of comparison, absolutely. Jennifer?
Yeah, they're both really self-reflexive films in that they're making evident their form in the process of producing them. I mean, The Princess Bride and its framed story and mockery of its own fairy tale status, while at the same time enjoying the fairy tale status. And that's what we have here too. Is it makes the idea of a musical set in this period ridiculous while we still enjoy that exact combination of things. And that to me is made the most glorious in that final number where they all sing "Life must not," I always forget it, "should not better be, could not better be." Those, you know, that line all together, even as this king has just slaughtered the family of the baby, taken over the throne, and there's the baby and everybody sings. I mean, that's just amazing. So it's this kind of deconstruction of form while reveling it at the same time that I think both of those films have in common, even if they're not the same genre. So that's a good comparison.
Meredith, the person without whom we would not be having this discussion, what are your comments or questions?
Hi, and I should say my husband recommended this movie way in the beginning of the lockdown. I had actually never seen it, and then I just got hooked on it and fell in love with it. So I'm really, really glad that you chose it to discuss. I was wondering if you could say something about the performance of masculinity, because that's what I think I find fascinating, that Danny Kaye goes back and forth from this sort of tender guy who's singing a lullaby to the baby to, you know, trying to be this sort of macho, you know, Giacomo the Jester. Because I felt like the movie was commenting on a fluidity of gender and masculinity that I thought was really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I have some thoughts on this. I think that this is one of the interesting things about, you know, about the broad genre of comedy, right? That we don't, when we are in the moment of finding something humorous, the surest way to no longer find it funny is to analyze it. But that being said, some of us have been interested in questions like these, and one of the sort of biggest sort of core elements of comedy has to do with changes in status. Either people who traditionally enjoy a higher status suddenly experiencing a lower status, or sudden shifts among status, or things like this. And in American movies and in Hollywood in the 1950s, one of the surest sort of ways to explore status and authority and power is through gender dynamics. And frankly, a lot of the comedy comes from the incongruity that is presented by a man who is so convincing as, a caretaker to a baby, which he objects to because he's a man, but then quickly sort of embraces. Also being the same guy who turns into this Lothario. And that almost seeming contradiction is in and of itself where a lot of the comedy comes from, even if we hopefully don't stop to think about it while we're enjoying the movie. Jennifer.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point. And I also, so when he sings that lullaby, it's really quite lovely, actually. I mean, it's Danny Kaye and it's silly, but that moment, he's a beautiful singer in that lullaby, and it seems very sincere and paternal. And I think you're right that there is a constant shift back and forth with these different kinds of masculinity. I think it's paired with another incongruity in the film, which has to do with his status with the little people. So at the beginning, they're told they're just entertainers, they're not needed in this fight. And then at the end, they're essential to the overthrowing of this king and bringing the baby back. So it's as if entertainment wins the day. And with it, Danny Kaye moves back and forth from this idea of himself as an entertainer, as a jester to the rebels, and then resisting that idea that he ought to be in conquest as a knight, and then going back to being an entertainer again. But that is actually what wins. It's entertainment that wins the day. It's the rejection of a masculinity that would win in a battle with a mace swinging around in the sky while riding on a horse. We don't need that. We need a show. And I think that they're paired together in a really interesting and positive way.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why comedy is very often a means for suggesting or exploring or discussing a bolder notion of cultural challenge or cultural change, because you have the changes in status, you have the incongruities that are inherent in comedy and that people are perfectly willing to accept in comedy. But then if you also have a plot where those changes or those surprises aren't only used for comedic effect, but to actually affect change within the world of the film, as you were just saying, there you have a sort of melding of a more serious point that there are multiple ways to achieve certain goals. There are different types of masculinity that can solve problems differently. There are different types of femininity, right? I mean, the captain was, we were constantly reminded how feminine the captain was, even though we were also reminded, certainly in the first portion of the film, that she was a soldier who was, respected for her position and her abilities throughout. And in a sense, it's sort of like the end of this movie reminded me of the end of Return of the Jedi with the Ewoks, because you have a force play a central role that was completely dismissed by both sides of the conflict earlier in the film, but they end up being essential to the quote unquote good guys winning. And so the good guys learn their lesson because they're helped, and the bad guys learn their lesson because they're defeated, about the value of different types of people or creatures, in the case of Return of the Jedi, participating. Rena, you have a question or comment?
Yes, this was so much fun to watch, and I had watched it as a child also. And as a child, I don't know how old I was. I just thought it was too silly and I didn't like it. But I loved it. It was just what we need at this time. And one of the things that struck me was how it relates to the Wizard of Oz. You know, with the little people, there's a song about, you know, something over the moon that was a little bit like Over the Rainbow in its sort of tone. There was the scene, you know, where the Cowardly Lion is in line with the guards, and Danny Kaye is doing that, trying to hide out behind the guards. The Cowardly Lion's tail is sticking out at the back. And then also, I mean, if you think about it in a way, it's about looking for a heart, looking for a brain, looking for courage, you know, and that's what Danny Kaye finds in himself, the ability to do those things, to love, to face the danger, to think up a plan that works. And on the other side of it, when we were talking about the gender balance, you know, really the most effective people in this movie, maybe even the only effective people, are the women, because Angela Lansbury has power that, you know, makes a difference. The witch is, you know, the only one who really manages to kill people. And of course also the captain. Oh, and one other thing was, I just thought it was hysterical, how they made the assembly line of getting rid of the people. I suppose that was a spoof of Henry Ford or something also. So there were just so many things spoofed.
Yeah, I mean, there were, and here I think we have a similar sort of question as we did with The Princess Bride, which is to the extent that these are in similar genres, to what extent is it natural that they would touch on sort of similar themes? I mean, there's an extent to which that, you know, most musicals in Hollywood at this time, and probably actually, if you think about it, most Hollywood movies at this time could be boiled down to being some sort of quest, right? And a big difference between this movie and The Wizard of Oz is that those different qualities that the characters in The Wizard of Oz are searching for are to some varying degrees being sought out by the same one person in this movie. And the fact that he undergoes the hypnosis and has to play so many parts within his part and all that, I think facilitate that, the ability for him to have multiple quests to go on. Jennifer, did anything about this movie, did you see any connection to The Wizard of Oz or anything like that?
I've always felt like The Wizard of Oz can be taken as like the urtext of American cinema. I mean, it's a film about film itself, you know, when she's spinning around in the tornado and looks at that window and we see everything flying by. It's a screen of everything that can be. When she lands in Oz, now we have the fantastical version of what our lives could be and what we could all become, the quest for what we want about ourselves. And I think that that's what we see in film. So I think you're completely right. Especially with the connection with the little people and the Technicolor and the value of placing colorful props around the frame. All of that certainly is consistent. And the search for courage and love, that's great. But I also feel like The Wizard of Oz is such a perfect film in that way that it stands for all film.
Carrie, you have a question or comment?
Thank you, Andrew. So I'm Generation X, so I grew up watching this film on VHS tape and knew it almost by heart as a kid. And then, of course, I watched The Princess Bride as a kid, which came out when I was a kid. And recently I've shown both of them to my 8-year-old. And it's been very interesting to see her reaction. She likes The Court Jester better than The Princess Bride. And I'm honestly really pleased because surprisingly, I feel like the court jester gender dynamics for my 8-year-old daughter are actually better than those in The Princess Bride. There's a moment in The Princess Bride where Buttercup has this big stick and Wesley's being attacked by an ROUS and she doesn't do anything. And I've been angry about that scene for 30 years. And then the scene in The Court Jester where they first meet the real Giacomo and Hubert picks up the big stick to hit him and can't do it. And Captain Jean whacks him over the head. I feel like is a better actually kind of image for me to present to my 8-year-old. So I was thrilled that she loved this one. I think she'll come around on The Princess Bride, but it's very interesting to see the gender dynamics all the way back from the 1950s being in some ways more progressive than a lot of what we've seen since then.
Yeah, I think our generation really, I'm also probably around the same age as you, I'm guessing, and we missed out on some kind of comedic gender dynamic thing. Because if you think about the comedies that we saw when we were young in the 80s, watch them now, those Molly Ringwald films, she had problems showing them to her own daughter. But when I show my students a film like Adam's Rib or other screwball comedies, they can't believe that those films were ever made with that kind of equality between the sexes that we see. And I can see exactly what you're saying with The Court Jester and watching it now and realizing what that film is actually suggesting about women's authority or the possibility to change one's idea about masculinity. It is quite progressive. I agree with you totally. I'm glad your kid liked it too.
Yeah, I mean, there's something about, you know, first of all, the movie has a tremendous budget for its time and for a comedy of its time. And you see a lot of that budget on screen. And I think that, you know, part of the wonder, I have a 5-year-old son, part of the wonder of these things is while they're savvier viewers than we often give them credit for, they're not so savvy that they identify all the things that make a movie look quote unquote old. So in a way you sort of, things are on more even footing than they are when, you know, when I would show movies to college students when I taught college and things like that. And that's a sort of, it allows for comparisons like the one you're talking about. And I think that the film is striking in that regard, particularly in comparison to those other sort of hallmarks of similar genres, or stories set in similar places, I guess is a better way to say it. I actually, I don't think we have any more questions or comments. So I would encourage people, if they do have any, there we go. Let's see. Barbara and Richard Hirsch, did you have a question or comment?
Thanks, Andrew. It's Richard.
Hi.
Hello, and Happy New Year. And thanks to Jennifer for a really great choice for New Year's Eve. Really was a good way to end a tough year. I wanted to mention two things that I saw in the film and ask you if you would comment on them. One of them was what I thought was a bit of an homage to Gilbert and Sullivan in the form of both songs that could have been classified rather as patter songs, but also this mistaken identity thing, like who you are is not who you are, and at the end it's all resolved because the person who really was turns out to be the person who really is. With the sidebar of the fox being, you know, a puzzle altogether. So that's sort of the retrospective homage. And I was wondering if you could comment also on how much it anticipates Monty Python, which is what I kept thinking of, especially Men in Tights, Monty Python Men in Tights. Because it seemed to me both of those are on each side of this film, and it kind of holds those two genres together over a long period of time. I also just wanted to mention, I kept trying to figure out where I knew Glynis Johns from, and tracked down that she was the original Desiree in Sondheim's A Little Night Music. And she was the person for whom he wrote, to her voice, the famous song, Send in the Clowns. So that's just a piece of Glynis Johns trivia. But I'm interested if you have any thoughts about the Patter song retrospective of Gilbert and Sullivan with the Mistaken Identity and the anticipation of Monty Python.
Well, I have no information on any of those. Jennifer, do you have any thoughts?
I don't know anything about Monty Python, but I can talk a little bit about operetta, because I think it's often forgotten how essential operetta was to early American musicals. And then the idea of operetta and that trope of mistaken identity and the kind of song that you're identifying, which isn't in all American musicals, but that is the Gilbert and Sullivan mode of modern major general, right? All these kind of language put together that we see influencing this. Sylvia Fine was an expert in musical comedy and certainly knew these operettas, so that could be why you see it here. But the earliest film musicals in the 1930s were drawn from the operetta, either adaptations of operettas or operetta style performances, because it was a familiar style to audiences already. And when the introduction of sound happens in the United States, you want to put on a form that people already get. An operetta is a form that mixes something about high culture with the opera with something of lower culture with popular song that people could understand, and yet there's talking in the middle. And so it's not surprising that operetta would still exist in the 50s. And in the mid 50s, we have a huge revival of operetta on television. So people were engaging in this kind of mode of performance in their homes as well. So I'm not surprised to see it crop up in this movie. I agree with you that it's there.
Also, they set the movie in a time and made it about, to some significant degree, about questions of honor and obligation and things like that, and playing a role and who plays a role and how it's played and all that, and that obviously plays into some of the themes Gilbert and Sullivan were interested in as well. Let's see, Joe, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I have a couple, just a couple quick comments. First, thank you for doing this. It's the first time I've joined any kind of a group at Bryn Mawr, and I'm thoroughly enjoying everybody's comments. I too grew up on this film, watching it on television when I was a kid. I believe I saw it at a matinee with a bunch of cartoons, probably when I was 8 or 9 in Northeast Philadelphia, and fell in love with it. I've seen it multiple times. I look at this film as just a grandiose comedy musical knockoff on the great swashbuckling films from the 30s and 40s, in particular, the Errol Flynn movies. I mean, gosh, they even hired Basil Rathbone, who was, the bad guy in all of those movies, to play the bad guy. And it works out perfectly. But at the end of the day, it's about two things. It's about the writing, which is comedic genius. I mean, how many years? Well, how long has it been since this film was released? And we're still reciting, the vessel with the pestle, the brew that is true. And we're still reciting, my family keeps on saying, get it, got it, good. These things have stayed with us for decades. And it's a rarity that those types of things happening. The songs, and on top of it all is Danny Kaye. And Danny Kaye in the 50s, in the early part of the 50s, was at the height of his career. He either jumped on board White Christmas right before this film or right after this film. He had already done Walter Mitty. He had already done, as someone earlier said, Knock on Wood. This guy was a major star at this point, and he continued that stardom all the way through his television show. But this is the film. This is, for me and Hans Christian Andersen, this was the ultimate Danny Kaye for us. And it's great to be able to talk about it and share those memories with everyone. The second thing that I wanted to say is a comment or a note that I wanted to pass along to Jennifer from my niece, who was a student of hers. Her name is Claire Hughes. And Claire Hughes wanted me to tell everyone that, Jennifer, you were the best teacher she ever had at Ursinus.
I'm sure she's exaggerating, but she's fantastic. That's great.
I told her I was doing this, and she said, I can't do it. I'm working tonight. Could you please tell her I love her? And by the way, she was the best teacher I ever had. That's what she said. I'm quoting.
Right. appreciate it. I'm glad you shared all your thoughts on the film too. And it's so fun to hear people who have seen it a long, long time ago and then revisiting it now. That's such one of the pleasures of cinema, is to be able to see something that you liked as a child with new eyes now.
Yeah, it's a great film, and I think 20 years from now, people will still be talking about it.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right that it owes a debt to those swashbuckler films from the 30s and 40s. This was obviously, I mean, there was obviously a strong Robin Hood element in the sort of premise of this. And that's what happens in life, and that's what happens certainly in Hollywood genres, that once a genre has run its course or come close to it, then it gets sort of, then it's fodder for satire and mocking. And it's interesting because I was trying to think I hadn't seen this movie in a really long time, and something about it when I was watching it seemed familiar, but I couldn't remember, but I didn't think it was from seeing it the first time because it was so long ago. And it was that in Singing in the Rain, I guess, which I was already thinking of because of Donald O'Connor, the film they try to salvage into a talkie is The Dueling Cavalier, which is also making fun of swashbuckling movies. And it sort of seems like that, by the time the 1950s comes around, Hollywood's ready to make fun of what it was doing in that genre earlier. And so that is a key element, because of course it only works if the audience is familiar with the thing that's being, satired or spoofed or whatever. So it's important that was a well-known sort of, current running through Hollywood cinema in the previous decades. Let's see, Janice, you have a question or comment.
Yes. Some of the things that you were talking about reminded me of the conversation that my sister and I had in preparation for the film. We often watch these things at the same time, although we're not together. And when we were talking about it, she reminded me that our mother had loved Danny Kaye. And of course, we're talking about an really older generation, and that she had, as a young woman, seen vaudeville. So that I think that she really responded she responded very much to his flexibility and his talent, but also that it had its roots in vaudeville. And as you were talking about some of the things that were in there, I think that it was a more sophisticated version of vaudeville in many ways.
Well, yeah, thanks for that, Janice. I mean, I think that there are so many performers in sort of the first, several decades of Hollywood that were either greatly influenced by vaudeville or in many cases came directly or indirectly from the vaudeville stage. And, so much, the movies were a departure from everything that came before, obviously, but they still borrowed lots of things, or things from other forms made their way in, whether it was genres which were in part borrowed from the stage and from literature, or whether it was, once sound comes along, conventions of stage musicals being transformed for the screen but still acknowledged, and then performance styles as well. We all sort of know the sort of how we like to sometimes laugh at silent screen, early silent era performances, because the people are performing the way they did so they could be seen from the back, on the stage from the back of the theater. The notion of the close-up as suggesting the dialing down of the acting style didn't initially make the transition. So that's certainly true, and vaudeville performers and vaudeville performance are definitely a big element of that. Let's see, Elise, you have a question or comment?
Okay, there, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Yes, sorry. Okay. I love the movie as well, and thank you guys for doing this. I really love the timing of the conversations and this film speeding up, and it's just an amazing construction in terms of rhythm and exchange. And I was wondering who was responsible for that kind of thing, the film timing speeding up and the rhythm of the conversations. That's my question.
Okay. Well, I guess there's sort of two elements to that, right? One is who literally technically makes it happen. And when it comes to the pace of scenes or the speed of film, the pace of scenes is the editor, the speed of the film has to be, in most cases, I think is at least, actually, I take that back. More in the last few decades, it would have been done by the cinematographer. This looked like it was purely done after the fact, that it was filmed at regular speed and then just sped up by editors. In terms of the decision-making process, there could be a few answers for that. It could have been in the screenplay. It could have been decided early in the production process, or it could have been a choice that was made completely after the fact. I don't know, Jennifer, if you have any thoughts or insights into that.
I don't know where it came from, but I will say that when COVID is over, we can all go to the Library of Congress and find this script in the archive where they're held the Sylvia Fine and Danny Kaye papers. And then we will know if it's in the script or not, but I don't know the answer to your question. It is a fun move though. I like it a lot.
Yeah. Okay. We did get a question from someone who wasn't able to raise his hand about Technicolor and sort of how that works, because this was very much, and Jennifer talked about the VistaVision elements of cinematography in her introduction quite a bit. I don't know, Jennifer, I don't think you said as much about Technicolor. Do you want to, should I talk about that, or did you want to say a little bit about it?
I think you can talk about it, and then we can point out how it works in VistaVision.
Right, that's good, great. Yeah, so Technicolor was a special process. It was, for the first couple of decades of Hollywood, the way they made films in color. And it was first in the early 30s, a 2-strip process. And then later, by the time Wizard of Oz rolls around and through into the 50s, a 3-strip process, meaning that a special camera was used that was bigger and heavier and actually had 3 separate strips of film in it, each of which captured a different segment of the color spectrum. If you think about the way back when we all went to an office and we had a copier with different toners, it had the 3 basic, elements of color that could be combined in varying degrees to create almost any color after that. The thing with Technicolor is it's doing that in 3 separate strips of film. Subsequently, Kodak would come out with single strip color film, which is a color film we all sort of are used to from movies from the mid 60s on, and certainly from when we all took pictures with film. But the 3-strip results in a couple of things. One, it results in an image that has an exceptional amount of clarity to it, because you have 3 strips of film capturing visual information. The other thing it leads to, because of the way that those strips combine to create the colors, it leads to a sort of hyper-rich examples or instances of those colors. We saw it in Meet Me in St. Louis 2 weeks ago. And you see it in this film as well. I mean, if you look at what Jennifer is so graciously pointing out, I mean, even Danny Kaye's outfit, which if memory serves was black, it's a very, very rich black that we a black that appears richer than a black outfit would in a black and white film, or even richer than it would in a single strip color film a decade or two later. You might have noticed in the credits that there was a Technicolor consultant. There had to be a special person. I don't know if there had to be. There was a special person who worked in concert with the cinematographer and others involved in the production, probably the costume designers as well, to give a sense of how a given outfit, element of the set, etc., would translate and would appear on in the finished film. The thing about Technicolor and the reason it's interesting, and I don't know the chicken and egg, aspect of this, but it obviously lends itself to certain genres more than others. I mean, there certainly were Technicolor Westerns, for example, but you can see how Technicolor was a real asset to a movie like this one, or Meet Me in St. Louis, or The Wizard of Oz. Places where you do want vibrancy, you do want hyper real, you do want some sense of fantasy. And that's something that Technicolor was really good at. But as I said earlier, this movie was one of the most expensive comedies Hollywood had produced to this time. And part of the reason that was the case were the filmmaking processes, were the VistaVision, which would have been more expensive than conventional 35 millimeter, and the Technicolor. So those were choices that were made in part because of the nature of the film, and I assume the anticipated appeal of the movie. Hollywood would have to do this, right? They'd have to sort of say, is this movie going to justify this sort of expense? And they thought this one would, and at the time it didn't. But of course, we're all the beneficiaries of that. It looks much better now than it would have had it been shot in other ways.
I want to say a couple of things about this very briefly. And one is that I think it's always nice to point out where labor comes from. And the kind of Technicolor vibrancy that we see here, we can actually trace back before Technicolor and before the two-step process, which wasn't as vibrant, of course, to the very early days of cinema, when teams of women would sit coloring in individual frames of film on dance films like Serpentine Dance from 1895, etc. So there has always been color film, but it was done by women given paints and coloring in single frames. And it kind of looks like Technicolor because there's this brightness to those films when you see them that you can imagine, even as the person who asked this question in the chat mentioned, is Technicolor natural? It doesn't look natural, right? I think natural would be a wrong word to describe it, but it looks like film natural, what people had been seeing already. For almost 60 years by the time this movie comes out. So it's a familiar kind of color scheme. Another thing I wanted to mention about it is its connection to VistaVision, because widescreen, staging for a widescreen image works really well with a film like this because of the physical comedy. We can see many characters in the frame at once. And there's a few scenes where we see this, where the king keeps kicking Danny Kaye as he's playing and revealing things to Sir, what's his name? The guy who comes in, the bad guy, the other night, when he comes into the scene. And we see the relationship between the princess, Angela Lansbury, the king, and Danny Kaye all lined up, and we can see their full bodies so that the physical comedy works really well. Griswold, thank you, Carrie. And then what Technicolor allows us to do is to have different parts. Usually widescreen is composed for thirds, and then you can see different parts of the frame colorized in very different ways. So even in this stupid example that I have as a background, because I thought it was funny to have Danny Kaye popping into my room if I sit in front of Angela Lansbury, blue, pink, and yellow, so that the frame can be divided visually by bright colors that only add to our interest and for comedic effect too.
Yeah, that's a really great point, that sort of lineage of hypercolor, what today to us compared to either the world we see or single strip color film and now single strip digital color looks hyper real. If any of you has ever seen like The Great Train Robbery, one of the 1903 film, there's a scene with a girl in a purple cloak, and you can see how each frame of that cloak was hand colored purple, and you can see where the extent to which the technicians mostly were, but occasionally weren't able to stick within the lines. And it's a comparable process. And I'm so glad you, in a number of ways, in terms of the labor. And in fact, if you look in the credits of Hollywood films, aside from performers and a few limited technical areas, such as, in some cases, composers, costume designers, makeup, you don't see a lot of women in the studio era involved in many realms of production. You will see women Technicolor consultants. And that is something you wouldn't have seen. I can't think of it's very rare in my experience that I've seen a woman listed as a cinematographer in a studio era Hollywood film, but you will see them. I have seen them on multiple occasions as the Technicolor consultant. So that sort of connects to your point, Jennifer, about, the women in those silent films being responsible for the color, and that carried through as one of, I guess, the acceptable areas that women could be involved in the production process. Okay, let's see. Liz, you have a question or comment?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I was just going to say this goes back that there are so many genres to be found in this movie that it's pretty incredible. I mean, we started with some and then just kept adding and adding and adding. I was going to say something about screwball comedy because of the differences of identities, and the rock around style, but it's pretty amazing that this movie is that way.
That it contains so many genre references.
Yeah,
yeah, it's stunning in that respect.
We have someone. Oh, he raised his hand. Mac, you have a comment, I guess, to make.
Well, my comment is more personal about when I met Danny Kaye. We were in California and were invited to the set while they were filming. And he was very, very generous and very, very kind with the time he spent with us. My parents, my uncle and my dad, put out a magazine in Philadelphia called The Exhibitor. And it was for theater owners. And because of that, we were given an entree to the sets out there, because the magazine also reviewed the movies before they came east. What was so interesting is over the years, we met a lot of these stars either in Philadelphia or out on the coast. And it was very interesting, the difference in what they were really like a sweet little Debbie Reynolds. She had a potty mouth. Barbara Stanwyck was the nastiest of all people. And then you had people like Danny Kaye and some of the other people who were really gracious and very, very kind, and not just put on. My favorites were, prior to meeting them, Abbott and Costello. And Abbott was an SOB. He was a nasty, nasty man. Costello was exactly as you would expect them to be, always on. But Abbott was rude. He was rude to his valet. He slapped them in front of a room full of people, and I couldn't really put up with that. After that, I lost interest in them.
So Mac, can we assume that you didn't see Danny Kaye slap anybody?
No. I said gracious when I made the original comment.
Right. Just making sure.
I didn't have the chance, but my dad spent some time with Sylvia Fine. I did not, but I met and I had a picture taken with him. I have a rogues gallery of me at 12, 13, 14, and a little bit older with a lot of the stars, because they would all come in to go to the previews. And every weekend was a preview down on Vine Street. And we never knew what we were going to see. It was whatever was on the floor. They were shipping it out to the movies. It was an interesting time. I saw every old movie for about a 10-year period till I went away to college.
Well, thanks very much, Mac, for sharing those memories with us. And I'm sure a number of people are pleased to hear that Danny Kaye was a gentleman and pleasant as he appeared to be. Thanks very much.
Do you think, Andrew, someone in the chat mentions that we should give some discussion to the little people in the film?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I think. I wondered if that person could share what their specific thoughts were with us. I think it's Meredith. I don't know if she's still
on. Okay, well, why don't we go to Arlene, and then maybe that person will put their
Hello,
hand
I'm
up.
Arlene.
Arlene, go ahead.
Okay, just one quick comment and then I'll give my real comment. I'm Janice's sister, and I just remember my mother really anticipating every one of Danny Kaye's films that she had the opportunity to see. It was just something she really looked forward to. But what I want to talk about is Technicolor. I recently had the opportunity to see a restoration of a 2-color Technicolor film, one of the early ones, which was called The Mystery of the Wax Museum, not the Vincent Price one, the one before that. And the colors absolutely amazed me because they were very red and very green, and I had not seen anything like that other than the coloration of silent films. So I looked it up, and this was one of the processes where they actually used 2 separate rolls of film, one with the red and one with the green. And alternately, the scenes were either more red or more green. So just wanted to tell you that restoration is out there and very, very interesting.
Thank you very much, Arlene. Meredith, go ahead. Meredith?
Hey, sorry. We were going back and forth between different devices. I just wanted to say more about the little people being real characters, not just figures of fun or stereotypes. They're active allies. They had some individual personalities. So I was just hoping to say a little bit more about that and just about the representation of little people, in general, on screen during this period.
You were hoping we could say more about that.
Yes, I am, because I can't say much more.
Well,
No,
I hate to disappoint you, Meredith. But other than saying that I agree with your characterization of the roles that the little people played in this film, I have nothing more to offer except to say that, like we were talking about with Captain Jean and the gender roles, it was one of the ways in which this film, I think, is surprising and refreshing, particularly for its era. Jennifer.
I also think they work with what I was trying to articulate but didn't very well earlier, that idea that we're pitting entertainment against masculine macho conquering, and that they come again at the end of the film. They had wanted to be part of the band, and they were sent away by the Black Fox at the beginning, but then they return at the end in the role of actually doing the conquering of the castle, only to have a glorious, entertaining song at the very end. We get it all wrapped up, and it's because of them. If they hadn't shown up, we wouldn't have the hilarious Ford-like assembly line of throwing dudes off the castle, right? And so I think they're used as part of this critique of masculinity that the film is performing. And I agree with you. I don't think the film is making fun of them. It's quite nice.
If I could say one more thing about this, because I was thinking about our discussion of Meet Me in St. Louis about the sort of Jewish, gay and feminist sensibility in that movie. And to me, this kind of reminded me of of Cavalier and Clay, if we think like way ahead, but it's sort of like that Jews and women and little people are saving the kingdom, you know, in this period after World War II, you know, when, you know, Jews are kind of like we're thinking about their place in the United States.
Thank you. I think that is an interesting point of comparison, particularly to last week. And if we think about the historical era, absolutely. Let's see. Joss, you had another question or comment?
Yeah, a couple of things. One about the visual style of this movie. So let me address that first. As I was watching this, I mean, it's an obvious, and there are obvious references to the Errol Flynn Robin Hood movie. And I wondered if they didn't use some of the same sets. I don't know if it was the same studio or not, but they were so strikingly similar. So I just wondered if anybody knew about that. And the other comment I have is that, you know, this as a parody of a genre, and the comments earlier about Monty Python, and I'm thinking about Holy Grail, which is more like this, and, you know, biblical epic, Life of Brian, and then the films of Mel Brooks, where he just one after another spoofs genres. Somebody brought up Blazing Saddles in the chat recently. And so I just wondered if there's any discussion, if there's any thoughts about genre parodies as a general genre of its own. So those two things, just the short issue of the visual style and the sets, and the genre parodies.
Okay, thanks, Joss. Jennifer, did you have thoughts on either of those points?
I mean, I think Andrew was talking earlier about a tradition of genre parody that happened also with Singing in the Rain. And when he pointed out the Dueling Cavalier, it also makes me realize that Singing in the Rain also had a reference to vaudeville with the training of the two guys. So there's the parody of vaudeville in that movie too. And genre parodies come about at different times, as Andrew was saying, when people get really familiar with the tropes of a genre. So that the late 90s, we had a lot of parodies of horror films. And those still exist, but you know, this kind of thing happens. What I always think about when I realize something like this and I see it making fun of the swashbuckler films, it always makes me think, why was that genre so popular to begin with? And when we start parodying a genre, we think, why is it that we wanted to see that story and those props and that idea over and over again? What did it give to us at that time, and why is it now done? And so it allows us to critique our society in interesting ways that we might not otherwise have noticed if genres just faded away and weren't parodied. So that's what I have to say.
Regarding the first question, if memory serves, those Errol Flynn films were Warner Brothers, and this movie was not a Warner Brothers movie. And also the fact that it was, this movie comes 15 years after or more after Robin Hood, makes me think it's probably not the same sets. These sets might have been used for other films from or closer to the same year as this one, 1956, but I would be shocked if they were from a film that long ago. Hollywood wasn't known for keeping things in that way. Robert, you have a question or comment?
Oh yes, about genre parody. So we've seen, as Josh said, the Westerns were parodied by Blazing Saddles, and this parodied the swashbuckler, and then we have parody of horror. I was wondering if you guys can come up with some other parodies of genre, like, for example, was there a parody of Italian neorealism, or a parody of the French movies like Les Enfants du Paradis, for example? You know,
well, let me answer that. I think there's an important distinction to be made, that neorealism isn't a genre, the French New Wave isn't a genre. Those are movements that filmmakers are generating or embracing that are at least to some extent tied to specific historical cultural elements of those societies at those times. So I think it's far less likely that there would be satires of those. I will tell you off the top of my head that one of my personal favorite movies, in part because it's just entertaining and in part because it couldn't have been made even a few years later after it was, is Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, starring Steve Martin and directed by Carl Reiner, which is a wonderful satire of film noir. So most genres, if they're around long enough, will, if not in other movies, then on television, will be subjected to this. I mean, The Simpsons did this to a lot of genres and a lot of specific films, and some of them it did very well, though certainly not all of them. But the key is, as we said earlier, the thing has to be broadly known for it to work. And it has to have had some toehold in the audience for that approach to be reasonably, at least reasonably effective. So there is that caveat. Let's see, Barbara and Richard Hirsch, did you have another comment or question?
I think, Andrew, I put it in the chat. I was asking if there were any other people who were considered for the leads in this, or was this one of those scripts that basically was constructed around the primary people they imagined getting, and they were able to get all of them?
Thanks for that. Jennifer, did you have any?
It seems like a vehicle, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I have to think that given the other movies that the duo directed, and the connection to White Christmas and things like that, that Danny Kaye must have been the focus of this. But I don't know for certain whether he was the only lead considered. But I think he probably was at the top of the list, if not the very top, then very close to it. Jennifer, any last comments or things that we didn't get to?
I don't have anything we didn't get to, but I'm just grateful to so many of you for joining us and making these so fun all of last year and continuing now in 2021. So thank you, everybody.
And we are grateful to you, Jennifer, for wonderful suggestions of films and wonderful discussion, and of course for pressing your whole household into service to make very fun and interesting and entertaining in their own right introductions. Jennifer will be back with us next week for a very different movie. Do not expect singing and costumes. It's a different movie, and so it's a different introduction, but still insightful and still in its own way visually interesting. So we look forward to that. We have a new slate of upcoming seminars, Tuesday night seminars scheduled. You can see them on the screen there. The one on January 19th on the movies of by Jordan Peele already has a robust enrollment. So if you're interested in that, don't wait too long before you sign up. We also have them coming up on different cinematic depictions of Macbeth, two-part introduction to Fritz Lang, short film, another one of our short attention span cinemas, and then the Oscars are late this year, so I will be talking about them late this year. And in addition to a history of the Oscars, I will be talking a little bit about the changes that the Academy implemented for this most unusual of movie-going years. So thank you very much. If you are new to what we're doing here, you can go to brynmarfilm.org and sign up for our emails. You will find out what's going on in Theater 5, which is our virtual cinema, or Film Studies Online, where we do all this. And I just want to say, normally at this point in time, Jennifer or myself or someone else would ask folks for donations, and I don't want to do that tonight. What I do want to do is thank everybody. We had a very, very wonderful, inspiring, robust, and warm response to our annual appeal this year. And so many of the names of people who gave, I recognize from the names on this screen and the names I've seen in these discussions over the many months we've been doing them. And we appreciate the support. I know a number of you gave multiple times last year, and I know a number of you gave either for the first time or one more time during the annual appeal, and we really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for joining us. While I would have a wonderful time just talking to Jennifer by myself about movies, I don't think she would have nearly the good time she's having if it were only me and not all of you as well. So we couldn't do this without you, and we appreciate it. And it's part of what makes the work we do so interesting. So thank you for joining us, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Happy 2021, everyone. Take care.
Bye.